So, geothermal is an energy source that, at least in energy policy circles, everybody seems to be talking about these days. But it was not always this way. And certainly within the world of policy, it hasn't been treated as such. And so, I figured to start, I might ask to everybody, why now, right? Why is geothermal on everybody's radar, and what enabled that?
Hey everybody, it's great to be here. This is a great event. Yeah, Thomas, I'm Ben Serrurier from Fervo Energy. And Thomas, you're right, in terms of the people talking about geothermal, it's really exciting. Historically, we used to joke that the bipartisan approach to geothermal was not to talk about it at all. And now at least we're seeing bipartisan support for geothermal. And that's a big change to get that sort of attention on something that we know is really exciting. So Fervo Energy is a developer of enhanced geothermal energy projects. What we do is we take the technologies that unlocked the shale boom, horizontal drilling, multi-stage plug and perf stimulation, otherwise known as fracking, and other subsurface technology improvements, drill bits, fiber optic sensing, et cetera, apply that to heat instead of hydrocarbons, and you see similar impact in terms of projects and resources. And what makes this a particularly exciting time from our perspective is exactly that. We commercialize technology to access subsurface energy in ways that are wildly more efficient than we did before, and that unlocked the ability for the geothermal industry to go after resources that were previously uneconomic or not attainable. Combined with that, we see, as everyone knows so well, the demand for firm power is growing in a way that hasn't for a long time. And so you've got a technology improving in the field and deploying right now, combined with the demand for that technology. The third piece of that stool is the bipartisan policy approach. We've seen some positive moves over the last few years. We need to continue doing that. That's really the third stool to unlock what will be a huge, huge resource here in the US and internationally.
Hey everyone, I'm Advait. I'm the Senior Associate for Energy Finance at the Center for Public Enterprise. We're a nonprofit research and consulting organization focused on housing and energy finance and developing financing solutions for the public sector to use market shaping to achieve our shared policy goals. Now, we do a lot of work on geothermal and clean firm technologies because we believe that there's actually a role to play for these technologies in the energy system of the future. Now, to go off of Ben's points, I'm going to talk about some of the macro framing in contrast between geothermal and some of the other competing energy sources. There is a material uptick in energy demand from technology, from advanced manufacturing, but we've heard a little bit about the gas turbine shortage. There's severe limits on our ability to install new gas power in this country. And while solar and battery can make up some of that shortfall, that depends on tax credits, installations, and there will still be some limits on the grid. In the breach, there's an incredibly bright opening for clean firm energy technologies like enhanced geothermal and some of the other geothermal technologies that we've been hearing about. It takes advantage of large energy customers' firm demand, long-term demand, and it's a zero-carbon resource with incredible potential across large swaths of the country, especially out in the Mountain West. Plus, as Ben said, it takes advantage of key American technology competencies and the oil and gas workforce that we already have. Now, a lot of our work is with green banks at the state level, with local policymakers, and even with federal policymakers trying to coordinate some states. And everyone outside the federal government, especially in state governments, is really interested in this resource. Geothermal pilots in rural areas can help get rid of old fossil infrastructure. They can actually make sure that local communities have energy resilience, energy reliability, and geothermal heating and electricity in cities can help minimize gas pipeline leaks and help decarbonize our gas infrastructures in cities as well. Building geothermal now lays the groundwork, quite literally, for lowering the cost of high productivity industrial development planning across the country, the same way that cheap electricity from hydroelectric dams in the 1930s actually helped lay the foundations for an American aluminum industry that won World War II. Geothermal promises something really similar for American economic development, and that's why I think I'm really excited about this.
Nice. That was a very nice intro for geothermal, I think better than I can do. My name's Joel Edwards, and I'm a co-founder and a CTO at Zanskar Geothermal, probably a company you all haven't heard yet, but we are a geothermal exploration company. We're venture-backed. We own and operate New Mexico's only geothermal power plant, and we have a slew of geothermal projects in development right now in the West, in Utah, Nevada, Arizona, and so forth. Our twist on geothermal is that we have brought in modern data science and geoscience tools to solve some of the subsurface challenges that have really increased the cost historically of geothermal development and have been a barrier to growth for the industry. And I think we're going to get into some of these questions here, but why is it geothermal's moment now? Well, principally it's the market. When we first started fundraising for Zanskar 5 or 6 years ago, talking to venture capitalists, they said that baseload was dead, that solar and wind had won, and that we were fools, and baseload was never coming back. Fast forward 5 or 6 years today, obviously that's not the case. There's generally an anxious hysteria for baseload power, projects that are viable in the near term, and that's why it's geothermal's moment, because at today's electricity prices and under the timelines that the market wants, geothermal projects are viable.
Awesome, thanks guys. Yeah, so Ben, to start with you here, you mentioned that Fervo borrows a lot of the horizontal drilling techniques that we learned from the oil and gas sector. What does that do to the economies of scale, and what does that do to sort of transform the potential for scale in the industry more broadly?
Yeah, so I talk often about how EGS is following the shale boom playbook, and that's true on the technology side, it's true on the commercial side, and it's also true on the policy side. And our CEO, Tim Latimer, likes to joke that it was like we were given the textbook, but the teacher version that had like the answers in the back. And so we're able to do this a lot faster than the oil and gas industry did, because we can learn and we can partner with those folks who are the best in the world at what they do. So I talked a bit about the technology side, right? So we're drilling into hot, dry rock. This is impermeable rock. We announced some new drilling results today that we reached a little over 15,000 feet in Utah, 520 degrees Fahrenheit. Our target temperature's coming in around 450 degrees Fahrenheit, and there's technical geophysical reasons for that. It's pretty widespread to be able to find that temperature at depth. We drill horizontally into those formations, pump in high pressure water and sand, create fractures, and connect those fractures with another horizontal well. So it looks a lot like shale because we're repeating those wells again and again and again. And that gives us learning curves that drive down the capital cost and increase the production of those individual wells. So we're building a 500 megawatt project in Southwest Utah. The first phase is 100 megawatts. It comes online in the middle of next year. The additional 400 megawatts comes online in 2028. It's fully contracted to utilities in the West. And it's the scale of those projects that we can unlock by A, having larger resources, huge resource base of impermeable rock with heat at depth, and we're able to access it using basically a machine learning type approach where we're repeating the same well design, and that drives down our costs as frankly we just get better at doing it and improve the technology that we're using to access it. So it's the same approach that the shale industry took, finding previously inaccessible resources and exploiting them in an engineering type approach that drives down costs and increases speed.
So Joel, Zanskar is focused on the upstream part of the development process. In particular, what historically has been broken about geothermal exploration, whether it be a technical problem or a policy problem or both, and what is the Zanskar thesis on how to solve it?
Yeah, geothermal exploration is definitely broken. I think that framing is right. And it wasn't always broken. And I would point to two principal reasons why on these themes of policy and technology. One is that the incentive to explore was taken away from the geothermal industry in the 2005 Energy Policy Act, where the right to own your geothermal discovery, let's say you invested a bunch of money, you drilled a bunch of wells, you explored a bunch of acreage, you found something that was really exciting, really hot, maybe 400 if you're very good at your job, 400 Fahrenheit. You find the thing, but the government says, thank you very much, we're going to put it up to auction, and now you have to bid on it, and you have to compete with other folks for this discovery. It wasn't always so. In the original Geothermal Steam Act of 1970, there was a discovery right, meaning if you went out and you found something, you could stake the leases to that right the day of. It was a lot like a locatable mineral is today. Under that old framework, the original Geothermal Steam Act framework, we built more than 80% of our geothermal capacity in a 10 to 15 year window because folks like Phillips and Chevrons and the like were pouring billions of dollars of inflation-adjusted funds into exploration and development and taking all sorts of risks out west. Unfortunately, since the passage of the 2005 Energy Policy Act, where they stripped that discovery right away, there have been precisely zero large-scale exploration campaigns funded by the private sector excluding geothermal. So there is just no private sector funding for taking all this risk to then not own all the risk that you took. So that's one piece I think that's been a big part of this. And then two, on the technology side, is historically, in the prior waves of development, the cost of a discovery was very high. And it was very high for a couple simple reasons. One is the methods that they were using at the time to find geothermal were very expensive. They were generally drilling pretty deep wells, and the per cost sort of method, embedded costs were very high. And then the second reason is just that they were not very successful at finding things, so they had a very high failure rate, so they would explore 10, 20, 30 sites, and they'd come away with maybe one or two that were viable for a power project. Part of that also is, at the time, they had higher thresholds for success, they needed higher temperatures for power plants and so forth. So generally, if you rewind into history, the cost of a discovery was very high. And this feeds into Zanskar's thesis on our formation, is we formed a company to drive down the cost of discovery, using sort of modern geoscience and data science tools and cheaper methods. And so we've done that over the last 4 or 5 years. We've built this sort of discovery flywheel where we pour all these geologic-related data sets into these big geospatial models, and we make predictions with those models, and then we send our field teams out, they test those predictions. In the early days, most of the time it was wrong. We would feed those failures back into the models, we'd update the models, make new predictions, send our field teams out, test those predictions, and so forth. That flywheel now has been running for 4 years, and we're now at the point where we're finding new sites at an order of magnitude cheaper per discovery than they found them in inflation-adjusted terms 30 or 40 years ago. And what that means is we're now finding a new site, a new geothermal hotspot, so to speak, roughly one every month. And cumulatively over the last 4 years, we've found more new sites with these modern tools than any company has found in US history.
So I mean, geothermal has been around, at least the name of the technology has been around for quite a long time, but in its current manifestation, it's relatively new. In many ways, it's still an emerging technology. That means that figuring out what the right capital stack is, how to finance new geothermal projects is really important. Advait has one of the best recent titles for a paper, which is Committing to the Drill Bit, which gets at these issues. And one of the points that you make is that developing a geothermal project is more like building a power plant than it is like drilling a wildcat well, which sort of separates it from the oil and gas comparison, which we often make. Can you sort of break down what that means for us and sort of the policy implications of that?
Sure, yeah. Thanks for asking. I'd be happy to. I think, first of all, it's really important that the repeated drilling that Fervo's doing and some of the technology development that Zanskar is doing are laying the foundation for actually lowering that break-even cost of producing geothermal electricity. That's going to be really important for the industry. And, true enough, these technologies do draw on the really innovative stuff from the fracking boom. That drove the natural gas sector, that made the US a natural gas exporter. But just because geothermal energy relies on this fracking tech and can lower its own break-even costs through repeated drilling, good technology, does not mean that the geothermal boom is going to happen the same way the fracking boom did. So in this paper, Committing to the Drill Bit, which is actually the title, had a lot of fun with this, we study the financial history of the shale drilling sector to draw on lessons for what worked, what didn't work, and what's replicable for enhanced geothermal. So a little bit of a history lesson then. The fracking boom wasn't just about technology. It's also about a market structure where a lot of speculative capital bet on the price of land and the price of oil and gas underneath it. In other words, this land value speculation, commodity, short cycle investment play, it's a lot like commodity trading. And power sector investment is not like commodity trading. Geothermal investment in a geothermal power station, it's a long duration, capital intensive investment that takes, well, take it like this. It takes weeks to get an oil or gas rig pumping, but it takes years to get a geothermal plant up and running. That's a lot more capital, and you can't just turn off a geothermal well the way you can turn off an oil and gas well. So you've got to spend upfront on your permitting, your siting, your turbines and your transformers. You've got to actually build your power station, buy the steel. It's not just the drilling that goes into this. And then you've got to spend on working with the utilities or whoever's buying your power to get those transmission lines up. Those upfront costs take years to amortize. You're going to need a long power purchase agreement. You're going to need a long term debt agreement. All of which to say, in the context of electricity markets and long-term power sector investments, it's not the same as an oil and gas market at all. The offtake is entirely different. So what my paper gets to arguing is that what geothermal really needs to scale up, this boom, is long-term patient project finance. Now, we've chatted with Ben about this. We've chatted with a few other folks in the industry about this. There are many investors out there, maybe even in this room, who are really interested in geothermal, and me too. There's a lot of potential here. But long-term debt is really what projects need to scale up to the kind of gigawatt scale we're imagining. Our team at CPE has actually been talking to a lot of folks in the industry and at the state level about what that might require. Within the geothermal sector and across the energy infrastructure space, we've been trying to socialize some of these project finance tools to make sure that state officials, industrial development authorities, federal policymakers know, here's how you actually develop the market structure around geothermal so that even if it won't end up like fracking, even if it's not a commodity play, here's how we make this power sector investment go big. Now, that's going to involve tax credits, loan authorities, drilling insurance. So geothermal is going to be a little bit like fracking, but it's a lot more than that. And the policy environment that we have to create needs to reflect these differences.
So people generally think of geothermal as relatively landlocked. You hear a lot about how much potential there is in the Mountain West in particular. But then you also talk to folks like Wilson Ricks, who is this big geothermal modeler. And he says he thinks that there's huge potential on the East Coast. And you hear folks in Pennsylvania starting to think about what sorts of policy tools they can use to bring geothermal to their state. How widespread could geothermal be with these breakthroughs? Or should we expect the next 10 years to be all focused on the Mountain West?
Yeah, so geothermal is a nationwide resource. And one of the reasons why it has been so focused on the West is because the West is the shallowest heat resource. And we're trying to develop these projects on easy mode, not on hard mode, right? And so the best characterized geothermal resources are in the Great Basin, in the West Desert. That's Utah. Really anywhere in the West has pretty good, but that's because it's newer land. Joel is more of a geoscientist than I am, so I won't try to get into any of the science, but trust me, it's hot, shallower. But one of the differences with oil and gas and geothermal is that oil and gas is in pockets around, and there's impermeable resources that have opened up a lot more of those resources, but heat is much more widespread at depth, and so that includes the East. It's just a question of how far down you have to drill. As we commercialize our approach in the Western US, where we do have good power prices, we do have offtake opportunities, we have a demand for firm power, and we have well-characterized shallow resources that we can access quite easily with today's technology, that drives down costs and improves the innovation of all the other pieces of the technology stack. It brings in the private capital that we're talking about. It brings in lower costs of speculative development capital, and it allows us to go into new territories that have never been explored for geothermal before. And much like all other subsurface energy resources in the US, turns out we have a lot of it. And as the technology improves to go access it, we find that there is even more. Similar to fracking, we started in the Bakken where it made sense at that time, and as the technology improved, it expanded to other basins, and now you've got places like, the Permian is the largest producer. And so I think when Wilson does some of this modeling, what he's looking at is, this is an economic question. What is the cost to access this resource? What is the risk to access this resource? And how much are you going to get paid for that capacity and that generation? And we can play around with both of those variables. And on the East Coast, where we're going to need a ton of reliable power, and there's nuclear, there's hydro, there's geothermal, some mix of those, as we push the boundaries of what is needed for reliable power, we can drive down our costs, and we can meet the market where it is increasingly on the East Coast. And that's the scenarios he's looking at. We commercialize in the West, we drive down the costs, and the actual real policy, the real market play, honestly, is probably in the East.
Yeah, I think this is one area where there's a little bit of divergence between Ben and I. We do think that geothermal's footprint will expand, for sure. Places like the Gulf Coast are obvious candidates. Things like the Haynesville Formation, which is in East Texas and Louisiana, is very hot. They complete wells frequently over 300 F at 10 to 15,000 feet. I think it'll look more like maybe raisins in a raisin cookie, where there will be pockets where geothermal will make sense outside of the West, and I agree with Ben. That might be in Appalachia, that might be in the Gulf Coast. There will be pockets. But I'm from a place called Iowa. It's a state in the middle of the country. And it's very cold rocks in Iowa. It's old Precambrian rocks at depth. They haven't done anything in a billion years. There's not a lot of heat there. And to build a commercial geothermal system, it would have to be EGS. And EGS systems, you need 200 Celsius. You would need to drill to around 8 kilometers depth, when you could drill to 1 or 2 kilometers depth in Nevada for the same temperatures. So I I'm personally not going to hold my breath for a geothermal power plant in Iowa, but I definitely think there will be other pockets. There'll be other raisins in the cookie that are going to pop up, and it's going to expand the geothermal sort of footprint beyond the West.
Great.
We actually don't disagree on that. Yeah.
So drilling still scares lenders. Obviously, right now, because we're talking about reconciliation quite a bit day to day, we're thinking a lot about tax credits. But when you think about that stack, tax credits, loan guarantees, cost insurance, right? What's the right mix? What should we be leaning on moving forward?
Yeah, I think if we're going to be using the image of a raisin cookie, we need to find more raisins. And I think this needs to be the goal of whatever we're up to in Congress right now. We've been developing at CPE a suite of ideas for de-risking the investment landscape for geothermal energy. And I mean, first things first, where reconciliation is concerned, keeping the tax credits is a must-have. It's simply like a necessary condition for the sector's success. But it's not a sufficient condition. And I think this is where some of the other planks in the federal and state policymaking playbook can be really useful. I think the Department of Energy's Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations and the Loan Programs Office are both going to be incredibly necessary here to preserve. I think the first for supporting pilot projects in new locations, finding those new raisins, and or trying new extraction technologies. There are lots of different geothermal startups that are not just the ones on stage, with different ways of, I think, accessing these resources. And the second, the Loan Programs Office, can provide large volumes of low-rate, patient, catalytic capital that'll scale up our ability to turn megawatts into gigawatts, on commercial terms too. I think that means expanding some of the sites where we're creating what I'd call a de-risked basin, which is where investors know that there's heat down there and the heat's going to last. That's, I think, what the goal of some of this catalytic financing needs to be. And once lenders see de-risked basins pop up across the country, and if federal and state partners can support the construction finance needed to get drilling in there, to prove flow tests, to prove that heat exists, then we're actually going to be in an ecosystem where public and private lenders are comfortable underwriting the construction risk of drilling. We're not there yet, but I think that's the goal that we have to achieve in the short term. Now, other countries, like Germany, for example, have insurance products for construction lending to make sure that in the geothermal sector, drilling is rewarded, or if it doesn't work out and you can't find heat, then you get to actually continue drilling in a different location and not have to worry about your company failing. I think it's really important that developers get the chance to experiment, and these insurance products will help them do so. So we're going to be writing and publishing this summer on some of those suites of insurance products that can make construction lending a little easier as well. And that's something the feds can do, that's something states can do. Which brings me to, I think, the next and final thing that's going to be necessary beyond reconciliation. We're going to need to standardize state-level policies. Geothermal, for all of what we know about it, is a bunch of raisins in a large cookie which does not have infinite raisins in it. It's geography constrained to a few resources where we know it's going to exist and to a few geographies where it might exist but we're not sure. So we need to bring states together locally to make sure they can share benefits and costs. Some states, like Colorado, have state-level geothermal tax credits. Some states, like California, have long-term clean firm procurement policies. We can combine these state incentives to make sure that simply because heat does not follow state boundaries, that drilling in one state can benefit multiple consumers across multiple states. So we've been publishing some strategies, not just where the insurance, where state harmonization is concerned, but in trying to create this a consortium of states working on geothermal together, we're also publishing on offtake contracts. I think I mentioned earlier that what a lot of project financiers need to see is someone who's going to buy your energy before they're willing to even lend to it. Our proposal for both geothermal and nuclear energy is actually modeled after a DOE program that you might not have heard of, but I think it's my favorite one. It's the Transmission Facilitation Program at the Department of Energy. That proposal suggests that the federal government or state governments can set up a consortium for an offtake contract authority, which provides upfront power purchase agreements to developers of clean firm technologies at a strike price. Those upfront power purchase agreements allow developers to take out long-term financing from lenders who might otherwise be too nervous to do so, and then that offtake contract authority can in turn resell parts of that power purchase agreement onto third-party customers who can't really predict their demand out 10 years, but they can predict it out 1 or 2 years. Besides, when projects are nearly done with construction, their risk profile is way lower. So the state taking a dealership function actually it allows states to shape the market for geothermal success over the long term.
Can I add one to this? Because I think one of the important points here is about the consistency of policy. We talked about how geothermal looks a little different than oil and gas sort of wildcat development, and in part because you have to build the well field before you build the power plant, right? You're building out the fuel source, and so you need hundreds of millions of dollars, I guess, to build out the fuel source and then the power plant, so there's a lot of finance need there. The more certainty that the market can provide as much as possible earlier in that process lowers the cost of capital and allows us to build more projects faster. And so there's a lot of policy tools for this. One of the reasons why geothermal is having a bit of a moment now is in the pre-IRA tax extenders bill, geothermal was left out, small industry, no one was thinking about it, c'est la vie. But it was down to 10% ITC at that time. So the Inflation Reduction Act did many things. One of them was to increase the ITC back to parity with other technologies, and that started to attract capital back into the industry. One of the reasons why Secretary Wright was correct in talking about the need to extend the runway for these projects is we're just starting to see the fruits of that labor now, and that allows us to get data. We've drilled 25 horizontal wells in geothermal like ever. We drill thousands of wells horizontally in shale. And so there's data that the oil and gas industry has found that we are just beginning to scratch the surface of, and we need those pieces of data to inform project finance folks, insurance companies, et cetera, to better understand these types of resources and how we build them out. And it's just at that inflection point, and it doesn't take a ton of capital on a per basin process, basically a policy that looks across a couple basins, to de-risk those basins because of the modularity of geothermal drilling approach. So we can do this at lower capital, but we need stability in the development capital time frame in order to bring in that lower cost of capital.
Cool. So we're running a little bit short on time here, but I am contractually obligated to ask a question about permitting reform. So, permitting gets quite a bit of attention these days. But my sense is that permitting's role in slowing down geothermal development depends a little bit on what sorts of geothermal technology we're talking about, and also, maybe it becomes more of an issue down the line increasingly as geothermal comes up the development curve. I'm going to open this up to anybody, but can you sort of comment on how permitting right now plays into development?
Yeah, at a very high level, geothermal resources today that we're building live out west. The federal government manages and owns the majority of the land out west. And so it's very hard to find a geothermal project or a resource that doesn't touch federal land. So basically all geothermal projects have federal permitting processes embedded in them from start to finish. And federal processes start before the project is conceptual. It starts at the leasing stage, pre-leasing. There's environmental review periods. It starts through the full cycle of the development when you're exploring and when you're drilling and building the facilities. And then it lives on when you're operating this facility. So, for example, at our geothermal power project in New Mexico, we are regulated by both the BLM, which owns the subsurface rights but doesn't own the surface. We're also regulated by the state, which manages the surface rights. So you've got a whole suite of issues that precede and post-seed power plant life cycles. And they don't just live within NEPA, they live within all the environmental laws that surround NEPA. So recently, Endangered Species Act language has been used to stop a few projects, but also NHPA and other permitting and environmental rules. So basically, geothermal, because it's resource-based, lives in the West and it's managed by federal policies, it's incredibly susceptible to federal policy. Even though geothermal as an industry historically has probably had the worst lobby out of any resource base, we just have consistently been left out of everything. Intangible drilling cost tax credits for oil and gas from like the early 1900s, they don't apply to geothermal even though we drilled the same wells. The tax credits to solar and wind, we didn't get them, oops. Locatable minerals, they can stake locatable mineral rights like the day they find something, oops, that doesn't apply to geothermal either. So it's just like across the board, we kind of stink at representing ourselves in DC. Folks like Ben are changing that, so thank heavens for Ben.
You, Joel. You.
This is my second visit to DC. It's great to be here. But we have to do a better job as an industry of representing ourselves here because, as Ben said, geothermal is a niche thing, and it has things that overlap with oil and gas. It has stuff that overlaps with minerals. It's a blend. It has stuff that overlaps with power projects. So it's a blend. It's kind of a mutt baby. And you've got to be really smart about how you regulate this mutt baby, but it's hard to do if you're not connected with the industry. So I think the higher level issue is just we as an industry have to do a better job of spending time in DC and talking about how these projects and the permitting cycles should look.
And it's the right time to be looking at this because we need more consistency in that permitting process. We do have to do exploration. We do have to build the well field. We do have to build the power plant. Those are substantively different activities. And if you have to go back and do NEPA every single time, and there's changes of staff, and there's changing in policy, and you're doing it over a multi-year basis, Every one of those is an opportunity to slow everything down. And again, we're deploying hundreds of millions of dollars into our well field. Then we have to go back and do another unknown amount of time to get the power plant built. We've put $500 million in the ground. We're gonna build the power plant. We're pretty committed. So can we rationalize these permitting processes so we get more shots on goal earlier, find more raisins where they work, and then have more consistency and more opportunity to basically know where we're going on the permitting process for the well field and power plant. And it's the right time. We got technological changes. We got to grow this industry. There's a ton of demand for it, and there's a lot of bipartisan support. I think there were 5, 6, 7 permitting bills, bipartisan support, passed unanimously out of the House last Congress. The only bill that I believe Senator Mike Lee, chair of VNR, and his ranking member, Martin Heinrich from New Mexico, the only bill that they've co-sponsored, and as far as I understand, possibly the only thing they agree on, is geothermal permitting reform. They co-sponsored the GEO Act. It's the best permitting reform bill for geothermal I've seen. It made its way into EPRA, and obviously that didn't pass at the end of the day. But the raw materials are all there to make progress on this. Everyone agrees we need to do it, and it's a huge opportunity for the industry.
Cool. Okay, so we are at time, but these three were conspiring to not answer this question before this, so I now have to ask it. How many gigawatts of geothermal by 2040?
I'll answer it by saying Zanskar. I don't want to speak for Fervo in the industry, but we're committed to building a gigawatt by 2033. And the first gigawatt's the hardest gigawatt, which I think Fervo's going through right now as well. But once you get through that first gigawatt, even megawatt, you've got a lot of these sort of project cycle things down. You've come down the cost curve. Your technology's been tested and deployed, and things are looking up from there. So I think 0 to 1 is harder than 1 to 10. And so our goal is 1 gigawatt by 2033.
I'm not going to give a number because I'm not in the industry, but I will say, speaking as someone who wants to make sure the industry succeeds through state and federal policymaking, try everything. We need to make sure that the federal and state governments have flexibility, both financially and administratively, to get these companies from 0 to 1, 1 to 10, 10 to 100. There's some big projections out there, but they are achievable. This technology works, and it's going to take federal support and state support to make sure it succeeds, and state policymakers deserve that kind of support from us.
So we could scale really quickly. We've got the oil and gas industry. They're ready to run. We've got the best drilling workforce in the world. We have a domestic supply chain. We have unlimited heat resources in the subsurface, and we've got seemingly unlimited demand on the power grid. So what we're missing in terms of getting to a 2040 number that'll be, aligned with Wilson's, blow your socks off projections is following the shale playbook. It's partnerships with DOE to put steel in the ground. It's continuing the tax credits, as Secretary Wright talked about yesterday. It's doing all the things we know how to do to bring in private capital, de-risk the technology, and, drill, baby, drill.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.